Welcome to a journey through the darkest corners of your kitchen and the messy history of the human stomach. Take a look at the food in your house right now. You probably have potatoes, tomatoes, coffee, or a bar of chocolate sitting on the counter. To us, these are just normal snacks. But if you showed these items to your ancestors, they might scream in terror. They might call you a witch or even have you arrested. This is the story of the forbidden pantry. For thousands of years, humans lived in fear of the very things they needed to survive. We labeled healthy vegetables as poisons, called delicious seafood trash, and believed that simple fruits could rot our skin or steal our souls. In this 15-chapter series, we are going to explore why we hated the foods we love today. We will look at the nightshade curse, where people chose to starve rather than eat a potato. We will see the social wall, where the rich refused to eat trash like lobster and oysters. And we will uncover the science of superstition, where we blamed corn and bread for causing madness and magic. Across these chapters, we will see how these fears were broken by the heroes of history, not with swords, but with forks and spoons, from the kings who used clever tricks to save their people, to the brave souls who ate poison just to prove it was safe. Every bite you take today is a victory over fear. So, get ready to open the doors of the forbidden pantry. Let's find out how the things we once feared became the things we can't live without. Let the chronicles begin. The history of the potato is much more than just a list of dates or a boring biology lesson. It is a wild, epic story of human survival, terrifying, scary stories, and kings who use clever tricks to save their people from starving. Today, we see potatoes everywhere. They are the fourth most important food on the entire planet. But for almost 200 years after they first arrived in Europe, people were absolutely terrified of them. They thought this lumpy, dirt-covered root was a deadly poison, a source of madness, or even a curse from the devil himself. To understand how the potato conquered the world and changed the course of human history, we have to go back to its original home, high up in the freezing mountains of South America, long before any European explorers reached the New World. A great empire had already mastered the potato. This was the Inca Empire. High in the Andes Mountains, the air is thin and the ground is often frozen. It was much too cold and difficult for corn or wheat to grow there. Because of this, the potato became the single most important thing for the survival of the Inca people. They didn't just stumble upon it, they were master farmers. They started growing wild potatoes as early as 8000 BC near a place called Lake Titicaca. Over thousands of years, the Inca experts created thousands of different types of potatoes. They had potatoes of every color: purple, red, yellow, and blue. They even figured out an amazing way to preserve them. They would leave the potatoes out in the freezing night air and then stomp on them during the day to squeeze out the water. This created a freeze-dried potato called chuño. This chuño could be stored in warehouses for 10 years or more without rotting. It was their insurance policy against famine. To the Inca, the potato was more than just food. It was holy. They worshipped potato spirits and even used the time it took to cook a potato as a standard way to measure time. If someone asked how long a walk was, you might say, "It's as long as it takes to boil 3 pots of potatoes." In the 1530s, Spanish explorers arrived in the Andes looking for gold and silver. They found plenty of treasure, but they also found this strange lumpy root. At first, they didn't think much of it. They brought it back to Europe around 1570, mostly as a curiosity. But the people of Europe were not ready for it. You have to remember that back then, almost all European food grew tall in the sun. Wheat, rye, and barley danced in the wind. But the potato was different. It grew in the dark, deep underground. It came out of the earth, covered in mud, and looked like a gnarled, ugly stone. To the people of the 1600s, anything that grew in the dark earth felt suspicious and unclean. Europeans quickly developed several huge fears that kept the potato off their dinner tables for generations. The first big reason was science, or at least the science of that time. Plant experts noticed that the potato looked very similar to plants in the nightshade family. This is a family of plants that includes deadly belladonna and mandrake, which were famous for being used in poisons and witches' potions, because the leaves and the green berries of the potato plant really can make you sick. Everyone assumed the tuber underground was a slow-acting poison. They believed that if you ate it every day, your body would slowly rot from the inside out. The second reason was religion. In the 16 and 1700s, the Bible was the most important guide for life. People looked through the Bible for any mention of the potato, but they found nothing. Wheat was the bread of life, and wine was the blood of Christ. But the potato was a heathen food from a land far away. Some priests even started calling it the devil's apple. They argued that since God didn't mention it in the Bible, humans weren't supposed to eat it. There were even rumors that it was a tool used by the devil to lead good Christians into sin or to make them act wild. The third fear was even scarier. There was an old medical idea called the doctrine of signatures. This idea taught that the way a plant looked was a sign of what it did to the human body. Because potatoes were bumpy, misshapen, and had eyes, people thought they looked like the skin of someone suffering from leprosy. A massive rumor spread across France and Switzerland that eating potatoes would cause your skin to fall off. It became such a big deal that in some parts of Europe, it was actually against the law to grow potatoes. People were so afraid of a potato epidemic that they would burn down any field where they saw a potato plant growing. Because of these terrifying stories, potatoes were treated as trash food for over a century. They were mostly used as food for pigs and cows. If humans had to eat them, it was only because they were in a desperate situation. Potatoes were often the only thing fed to prisoners in dungeons or to the very poorest peasants who were literally starving to death. Wealthy people wouldn't even let a potato touch their plates. They believed that eating such heavy food from the dirt would make a person's brain slow, heavy, and unintelligent. So, how did we get from devil's apple to French fries? The change only happened because of a few very brave and very smart leaders who realized that the potato was a miracle food. They saw that a single acre of potatoes could produce much more food than an acre of wheat. They knew that if they could just get people to eat them, they could end hunger forever. One of the greatest heroes of the potato was a Frenchman named Antoine Augustin Parmentier. He was a pharmacist who served in the army. During a war, he was captured by the Prussians and thrown into a prison cell. For years, his captors fed him nothing but potatoes. Parmentier waited for his skin to fall off from leprosy or for his mind to go mad, just like the story said. But a strange thing happened. He didn't get sick. In fact, he felt stronger and healthier than ever before. When he was finally released and went back to France, he made it his life's mission to save the potato's reputation. But he knew that just telling people it was healthy wouldn't work. People are stubborn. So he used a brilliant bit of reverse psychology. He planted a large field of potatoes on the edge of Paris. But instead of leaving it open, he hired heavily armed guards to watch the field during the day. He told the guards to march around and act like they were protecting a royal treasure that only the king was allowed to eat. The local peasants watched this and thought, if the king is guarding those mud rocks with soldiers, they must be the most delicious things in the world. Then came the clever part. Parmentier told his guards to go home at night and leave the field completely unguarded. Just as he hoped, the peasants snuck into the fields under the cover of darkness, stole the potatoes, and ran home to plant them in their own secret gardens. By making the potato seem forbidden, he made it popular. He even held fancy dinner parties where every single dish, from the soup to the dessert, was made of potatoes. He even invited famous people like Benjamin Franklin to these dinners to show the world that potatoes were for the elite. While this was happening in France, a similar story was playing out in Prussia with King Frederick the Great. His country was suffering from terrible bread shortages, and he knew the potato was the answer. But his people hated them. They told him, the dogs won't eat them, so why should we? The king didn't give up. He issued a famous order called the Potato Decree. He made it the law that every farmer had to plant them. To set an example, he had a royal potato patch planted right in front of his palace. He would sit out on his porch and eat boiled potatoes in front of everyone to prove they weren't poison. Today, if you visit his grave in Germany, you won't see many flowers. Instead, people still leave potatoes on his gravestone to thank him for saving the country from hunger. Eventually, the potato moved into Ireland, and this is where the story takes a massive turn. The Irish were very poor at the time, and their land was often damp and rocky. Wheat didn't grow well there, but the potato loved the Irish rain. It was a perfect match. A tiny patch of land and the milk from one cow could provide enough food for a family of 6 for an entire year. Because the food was so cheap and nutritious, the population of Ireland exploded. It went from less than 1 million people to over 8 million people in just 100 years. For a while, it seemed like a miracle. The potato had turned one of the poorest places in Europe into a thriving country. But this success had a hidden danger. Because the potato was so easy to grow, the Irish stopped growing almost anything else. Even worse, they were mostly growing just one single type of potato called the lumper. This meant that every potato in Ireland was biologically identical. In 1845, disaster struck. A tiny fungus called the blight arrived on a ship from the Americas. It spread through the damp Irish air like wildfire. It was like something out of a horror movie. A farmer would go to bed looking at a beautiful green field of potato plants, and when he woke up the next morning, the leaves would be black and shriveled. When they tried to dig up the potatoes, they found nothing but a black, slimy, foul-smelling mush. The food that had saved Ireland was now rotting in the ground because the people relied on this one plant for almost all their calories. The result was the Great Famine. Over 1 million people died of hunger, and millions more were forced to leave their homes. They packed into coffin ships and sailed to America, Canada, and Australia. This mass migration changed the face of the United States and the world forever. It's the reason why so many people today have Irish roots. The story of the potato is a reminder of how much power a single plant can have. It was the first global food to be tested by the world. It had to survive being called a poison, a tool of the devil, and a cause of leprosy. It had to be stolen by peasants and championed by kings. It fueled the Industrial Revolution by feeding the workers in the new factories, and it caused one of the biggest migrations in history. Today, we don't think twice when we see a bag of potatoes at the store. We see them as a simple, humble side dish. But the next time you eat a fry or a baked potato, remember that you are eating a survivor. You are eating a plant that came from the highest mountains, survived the darkest superstitions, and used the cleverness of kings to become the most successful. Traveler, in the history of food, the lowly root in the dirt turned out to be more powerful than all the gold the explorers ever found. It didn't just fill our stomachs, it built our modern world. If you look in almost any kitchen today, you will find a tomato. We use them for pizza sauce, pasta, salads, and ketchup. They are bright, juicy, and healthy. But for nearly 200 years, people in Europe and North America believed that the tomato was a silent killer. They called it the poison apple. They believed that eating just one of these bright red fruits would lead to a painful and certain death. The story of the tomato is a mystery that involves accidental poisonings, strange scientific mistakes, and a brave man who stood on a courthouse steps to prove everyone wrong. To understand where the fear started, we have to look at the tomato's family tree. Just like the potato we talked about in the last chapter, the tomato is a member of the nightshade family. In the 1500s, people knew that many nightshade plants were deadly. They knew that if you ate the leaves of certain weeds, you would get sick or die. When the tomato first arrived in Europe from the Americas, plant experts noticed the leaves looked very similar to these poisonous weeds. They immediately told everyone to be careful. They warned that the tomato was a deadly fruit that should only be grown for decoration, not for eating. But there was an even scarier mystery happening in the homes of the wealthy. During the 1700s, many rich aristocrats in England and Europe started getting sick and dying after eating tomatoes. It seemed like the warnings were true. People would sit down for a fancy dinner, enjoy a dish with tomatoes, and then suffer from terrible stomach pains and lead poisoning. Because they didn't have modern science, they blamed the tomato. They thought the tomato was sucking the life out of people. However, the tomato was actually innocent. The real killer was hiding right under their food. Back then, wealthy people loved to use pewter plates. Pewter is a type of metal that was very high in lead. Tomatoes are very acidic, which means their juice is like a mild cleaner. When a tomato touched a lead plate, the acid would pull the lid out of the metal and into the food. The rich people weren't dying from the tomato. They were dying from lead poisoning caused by their own expensive plates. The poor people, on the other hand, didn't have this problem. They couldn't afford metal plates, so they ate off of wood or simple clay. Because their plates didn't have lead, they could eat tomatoes all day long and stay perfectly healthy. But the rich didn't talk to the poor about their food. So, for a long time, the poison apple kept its scary reputation. In the world of science, things were just as bad. A famous scientist named Carl Linnaeus gave the tomato its official name. He called it the wolf peach. He chose this name because of an old German legend that said nightshade plants could be used to summon werewolves. He thought the tomato looked like a peach, but acted like a wolf, something dangerous and wild. This name stuck, and it only made people more afraid. People would plant tomatoes in their gardens because they looked pretty and red, but they would warn their children never to touch them, fearing they would turn into a monster or drop dead. While the rest of the world was terrified, one city in Italy was starting a revolution. That city was Naples. The people in Naples were very poor, and they often didn't have enough to eat. They saw the bright red tomatoes growing in gardens and decided to take a risk. They began to crush the tomatoes and spread them on their flatbread. This was the very beginning of the pizza we know and love today. They realized that not only was the tomato safe, but it was also delicious and filling. For a long time, pizza was a secret food that only the poor people of Naples ate. High society still thought it was disgusting and dangerous. But in 1889, everything changed. The Queen of Italy, Queen Margherita, was visiting Naples. She had heard about this peasant bread with tomatoes and wanted to try it. A local baker made her a special pizza with tomatoes, white mozzarella cheese, and green basil to match the colors of the Italian flag. The Queen loved it so much that she gave it her name. Once the Queen said the tomato was safe, the rest of the world finally started to listen. But the fear didn't go away easily in America. In the early 1800s, many Americans still thought the tomato was a decorative weed. They believed that eating them would turn your blood into acid or cause your stomach to rot. This is where we meet a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson. He lived in New Jersey, and he was tired of people being afraid of a healthy vegetable. In 1820, he announced that he was going to do something incredible. He told the entire town that he would stand on the steps of the local courthouse and eat an entire basket of tomatoes. People were shocked. They thought they were going to watch a man commit suicide in public. On the day of the event, a huge crowd gathered. Some people brought their doctors, and some even brought a coffin because they were so sure he would die. Johnson stood on the steps, picked up a bright red tomato, and took a big bite. The crowd gasped. He ate another and another. He finished the whole basket and stood there smiling. He didn't get sick. He didn't turn into a werewolf. He didn't drop dead. The crowd was amazed. This one event helped break the spell of fear in America. Soon after, farmers started growing tomatoes for food instead of just for show. As the years went by, the tomato became a global superstar. During the American Civil War, soldiers were given canned tomatoes because they were easy to carry and didn't spoil. This helped spread the love for tomatoes to every corner of the country. Then came the invention of the glass bottle, which led to the creation of tomato ketchup. Suddenly, the poison apple was on every table in the world. Today, we know that tomatoes are actually a superfood. They are full of vitamins that help our hearts and our skin. It is hard to believe that for hundreds of years, people would rather starve than take a bite of one. The story of the tomato teaches us that sometimes the things we are most afraid of are actually the things that are best for us. The tomato had to survive being blamed for lead poisoning, being called a wolf peach, and being seen as a tool for witches. It took the hunger of the poor in Naples and the bravery of a man in New Jersey to show us the truth. Now, when you see a tomato on your burger or your pizza, remember, its long journey. It went from a deadly poison to a royal favorite, and finally, to the most popular fruit in our kitchens. It is a true survivor that conquered the world one bite at a time. Imagine for a moment that you are living in the 1600s. You are walking along the windy beaches of Massachusetts in America. As you look down at the sand, you don't see the beautiful shells or clear water we think of today. Instead, you see giant, dark piles of lobsters. They are stacked 2 feet high, crawling over one another and stretching as far as the eye can see. In those days, there were so many lobsters that they would simply wash up with the tide and stay there, dying in the sun. Back then, people didn't see these creatures as a special treat or a luxury. In fact, they didn't even see them as food for humans. They saw them as a nuisance and a sign of a dirty ocean. They called them sea cockroaches or the bugs of the sky. See, if you were a person living in a nice house, the last thing you wanted was to be seen eating a lobster. In those days, if someone saw you with a lobster on your plate, they would feel very sorry for you. It was a sign of extreme poverty. It meant you were so poor that you couldn't afford to buy real meat like chicken, pork, or beef. It was considered the lowest of the low. The story of the lobster is perhaps the greatest rebranding story in the entire history of food. It is a story about how something that was once used as garden fertilizer and pig food became a symbol of wealth and high class. This journey involves angry servants, clever train companies, and a big change in how we understand cooking. To understand how much people hated lobsters in the beginning, we have to look at how they were treated in early American history, because there were millions of them just sitting on the beaches. They were essentially free for the taking. You didn't even need a boat or a net. You could just pick them up with your hands. Farmers would drive their wagons down to the shore, fill them up with thousands of live lobsters, and then take them back to their farms. They didn't eat them, though. They ground them up into a paste and spread them on the soil. They believed that the only thing a lobster was good for was being fertilizer to help their corn grow better. If they had too many lobsters for the garden, they would simply throw them to the pigs because they cost nothing. Lobsters became the main food for people who had no choice in what they ate. This included prisoners in dark jails, servants in wealthy homes, and the very poorest children who had no other options. In many towns, it was actually considered cruel to feed people too much lobster. Think about that for a second. Today, a lobster dinner is a celebration, but back then, it was seen as a form of torture. There are famous records of indentured servants in the Massachusetts Bay Colony who got so tired of eating lobster every single day that they actually started a revolt. They were being fed lobster for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because it was the cheapest way for their masters to keep them alive. These servants actually took their masters to court and won a legal battle. The local government had to pass a law that banned masters from feeding their servants lobster more than 3 times a week. The court ruled that forcing someone to eat lobster every day was a form of inhumane punishment to the people of that time. Being fed lobster was like being fed rats or insects today. But why did they think it was so gross? There is a very good reason for this, and it has to do with science. Today, we know a secret that the early settlers didn't quite understand. A lobster's body has very powerful enzymes that start to break down its meat as soon as it dies. If a lobster is not cooked while it is still alive, or very shortly after it dies, the meat turns soft, gray, and mushy. It loses all its flavor and starts to smell like old mud very quickly. In the 1700s, they didn't have refrigerators or ice. They would catch hundreds of lobsters, let them sit in big hot piles for days, and then boil them all together in a giant pot. By the time that meat reached a prisoner or a servant, it was a disgusting, gray, smelly mess. They didn't have melted butter, fresh lemons, or fancy seasonings to hide the taste. They just ate the plain, mushy meat. If you had to eat gray, mushy sea bugs every single day, you would probably go on strike too. The big change started in the mid-1800s, and it was all thanks to 2 big inventions, the tin can and the railroad. Around 1840, people figured out how to cook lobster meat and seal it inside tin cans. This was a game changer. It meant that people living far away from the ocean, in places like the middle of the desert or high in the mountains, could finally taste lobster. Because these people lived so far away, they had never seen a lobster crawling on a beach. They didn't know they were called sea cockroaches. To someone living in a dusty town in the middle of the country, a can of lobster meat was something exotic and interesting. It didn't look like a bug once it was out of the shell. It just looked like a unique type of pink meat. This was the first time that the lobster started to lose its trashy reputation. But the real turning point, the moment that changed everything, was the invention of the passenger train. When the first big railroad started running from the coast to the center of the country, the companies wanted to make the trips feel very special and expensive. They built beautiful dining cars with mahogany wood, velvet seats, and white tablecloths. They wanted to serve meals that felt exotic to their passengers. The managers of the railroad companies realized they had a golden opportunity. They could go to the docks in Boston or Maine and buy thousands of lobsters for almost no money at all. They decided to cook the lobsters fresh right there on this train and serve them to the passengers who lived inland. These passengers were usually wealthy people who were traveling for the first time. They had no idea that lobster was trash food back on the coast. They sat down at those fancy white tables, and a waiter in a tuxedo brought them a bright red, steaming lobster on a silver platter. It was served with fresh, hot butter and beautiful garnishes. The passengers looked at this strange, red creature and thought it was the most amazing thing they had ever seen. Because the train companies charged a very high price for the meal, the passengers assumed it must be a rare and special delicacy. This was a massive psychological trick. By putting the sea bug on a silver platter and charging a lot of money for it, the railroad companies turned it into a luxury. When these wealthy travelers finally reached the coast and went to fancy restaurants, they started asking for the delicious red meat they had eaten on the train. The chefs at the restaurants were shocked. They realized that they could stop feeding the lobsters to the pigs and start charging the rich tourists a fortune for them. By the late 1800s, the reputation of the lobster had completely flipped. In cities like New York and Washington, D.C., eating lobster became the ultimate fashionable thing to do. If you were a high society person, you wanted to be seen at a restaurant with a whole lobster in front of you. As more and more people started to want it, the supply of lobsters began to drop. In the world of food and economics, there is a simple rule. When something is hard to find, the price goes up. Because we had been using lobsters as fertilizer and pig food for so long, we had treated the population like it would never end. But once it became a luxury, the price started to skyrocket. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the lobster was officially the king of seafood. It was the food of movie stars, millionaires, and royalty. However, the story has one more strange twist. During World War II, the lobster almost became trash again for a few years because the United States government was sending all the beef, chicken, and pork to the soldiers fighting in Europe and the Pacific. The people staying at home had to find other things to eat. Food was rationed, which meant you were only allowed to buy a certain amount of meat each week. But lobster was not rationed. You could buy as much of it as you wanted. Because of this, for a short time, it became a common food once more. It was actually cheaper than hamburger meat during the war. People started putting lobster meat into simple sandwiches and even serving it in school cafeterias for children. For a brief moment, the luxury was gone, and it was just a way to keep people full during a difficult time. But as soon as the war ended and the soldiers came home, the luxury status returned with a vengeance. Chefs started getting much more creative. They realized that the secret to the lobster wasn't just the meat itself, but the experience of eating it. They created famous dishes like lobster thermidor, which is lobster meat cooked with wine, cream, and cheese. They invented lobster bisque, a rich, creamy soup that felt like pure gold. They even made the lobster roll, taking that simple wartime sandwich and turning it into a high-end treat that people would stand in line for hours to buy. They perfected the art of the fresh, kill. They made sure that every restaurant had a tank of live lobsters right in the front window. This was another marketing trick. It showed the customers that the food was fresh, but it also made the lobster look like a trophy. You would point at the one you wanted, and the chef would cook it just for you. This made the diner feel powerful and wealthy. Today, the lobster is one of the most expensive items on any menu in the world. People will happily pay $50, $80, or even $100 for a single lobster dinner. It is the food we choose for weddings, anniversaries, and big celebrations. It is hard to believe that just a few hundred years ago, a master could be taken to court for animal cruelty if he fed that same lobster to a servant one too many times. The incredible journey of the lobster teaches us a very important lesson about the world of food. It teaches us that luxury and trash are often just ideas in our heads. A lobster didn't change its biology over the last 400 years. It is the same creature today that it was when it was washing up on the beaches in giant, smelly piles. The only thing that changed was us. We stopped seeing it as a sea cockroach and started seeing it as a treasure. We stopped boiling it until it was mushy and started serving it with drawn butter and lemon. We took it off the garden floor and put it on a silver platter. The lobster survived being used as fertilizer, being the reason for servant strikes, and being a punishment for prisoners in jail. It took the clever minds of the railroad companies and a big change in how we cook to show us the truth. Now, when you go to a fancy restaurant and see a lobster in a tank, or when you see someone eating a luxury lobster roll, remember its long and strange history. Remember that it used to be the most hated food in America. It is a perfect reminder that with the right presentation and a little bit of butter, even the bug of the sea can become the king of the kitchen. The lobster is the ultimate survivor, proving that even a sea cockroach can win the hearts of the entire world. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking through a dark, foggy forest hundreds of years ago. The ground is damp, and the air smells like wet leaves and old wood. Suddenly, you look down and see something strange. Overnight, a circle of white, lumpy shapes has popped up out of the dirt. They weren't there yesterday. They have no leaves, no seeds, and no roots. They look like tiny umbrellas for creatures of the night. In the Middle Ages, if you saw this, you wouldn't think. Dinner is served. You would probably run away as fast as you could. You would think you had found a fairy ring, and you would believe that the ground was cursed by magic or the devil. The story of the mushroom is perhaps the most mysterious and frightening story in the entire history of food. For thousands of years, humans looked at mushrooms with a mixture of deep respect and absolute terror. They are not quite plants, and they are certainly not animals. They belong to a kingdom of their own called fungi, because they grow from death and decay, and because some of them can kill a human in just one bite. They were known for a long time as the witch's umbrella or the devil's bread. This is the story of how we learned to stop fearing the forest floor and started seeing the mushroom as a gourmet masterpiece. To understand why people were so afraid, we have to talk about the mushroom mystery. Unlike a potato or a tomato, which we talked about in earlier chapters, a mushroom is a master of disguise in the forest. There are mushrooms that look beautiful and delicious, but are actually full of deadly poison. There is one called the destroying angel. It is bright white and looks pure and clean, but if you eat it, it will destroy your liver and kidneys within days. Then there is the death cap, which looks very similar to the common mushrooms we buy at the grocery store today. Back in the days before we had science and textbooks, there was no easy way to tell which ones were safe and which ones were deadly. There were no rules that worked. Some people thought that if a mushroom had a ring on its stem, it was safe. They were wrong. Others thought that if you boiled a mushroom with a silver spoon and the spoon turned black, the mushroom was poisonous. This was also completely wrong. Because of these mistakes, people died all the time. Entire families would sit down for a meal they picked in the woods and never wake up. Because of this constant danger, the mushroom became a symbol of death and fear. In ancient Rome, mushrooms were known as the food of the gods, but they were also used as a weapon for murder. One of the most famous stories involves the Roman Emperor Claudius. His wife, Agrippina, wanted her son Nero to become the emperor. To get Claudius out of the way, she allegedly fed him a plate of his favorite mushrooms, but she had laced them with poison. He died shortly after, and the mushroom became known as a tool for killers. Even popes weren't safe. Pope Clement VII died in the 1500s after eating a deadly mushroom. When the most powerful leaders in the world were being taken down by a tiny fungus, the common people took notice. They decided it was better to be hungry than to be dead. For centuries across Europe, mushrooms were treated as a peasant's gamble. Only the poorest of the poor, the people who were literally starving to death and had nothing else to eat, would take the risk of picking wild mushrooms. They were seen as trash food that only a desperate person would touch. But the fear wasn't just about poison. It was also about magic and superstition. Because mushrooms often grow in circles, people called them fairy rings. Legends said that these rings were created by dancing fairies or witches at night. People believed that if a human stepped into the ring, they would be cursed, or they would be forced to dance until they died of exhaustion. Some cultures believed that mushrooms only grew where lightning hit the ground, or that they were the spit of the devil, because they sprouted so quickly. Sometimes, in just a few hours, people thought they were unnatural. Everything else in the garden took weeks or months to grow. But the mushroom felt like a ghost that appeared out of nowhere. So, how did we go from being terrified of ghost plants to putting them on our burgers and in our fancy soups? The change started in France, and it happened because of a very famous king, King Louis XIV. He was known as the Sun King, and he loved to show off his wealth and his sophisticated taste in food. In the late 1600s, his royal gardeners discovered something interesting. They found that the common meadow mushroom could be grown on purpose if you used the right kind of fertilizer. Mostly horse manure, the king tried them and loved the earthy, rich flavor. He decided that mushrooms shouldn't be a peasant's gamble anymore. He wanted them to be a royal delicacy. He ordered his gardeners to grow them year-round. But there was a problem. Mushrooms don't like the hot sun or the cold wind of a regular garden. They like it dark, damp, and still. The gardeners found the perfect spot. The giant underground caves and tunnels beneath the city of Paris. These caves were left over from when the city was built with stone. They were dark. The temperature was always the same, and the air was perfectly damp. This was the birth of cultivated mushrooms. Because they were grown in a controlled place, the danger of getting a poisonous look-alike was gone. For the first time in history, you could eat a mushroom and be 100% sure you wouldn't die. Because the king was eating them, they suddenly became the most fashionable food in Europe. They were called Paris mushrooms, and they became a sign of being wealthy and civilized. If you were a rich person in the 1700s, you wanted to serve mushrooms at your dinner parties to show that you had the money to buy them from the professional growers in the Paris caves. The witch's umbrella had been moved from the scary forest floor to a royal palace. But the rest of the world still needed to be convinced. In England and America, the fear of toadstools lasted much longer. For many years, people used the word, mushroom, for the ones you can eat and toadstool for the ones that kill you. But there is actually no scientific difference between the two words. It was just a way for people to try to manage their fear. In the late 1800s, the mushroom finally became a science. Scientists began to study fungi and figure out exactly how they worked. They learned that mushrooms are the fruit of a much larger organism living underground called mycelium. Think of the mycelium like a giant underground web, and the mushroom is just the part that pops up to spread seeds, which are called spores. Once people understood the science, the magic and the ghosts started to fade away. People realized that mushrooms weren't cursed. They were just a very unique part of nature that played a vital role in cleaning up the forest. They are the Earth's recyclers. They break down old wood and leaves and turn them back into rich soil. Without mushrooms, the forests would be piled high with dead trees. This cleaning job is why they grow on decay, not because they are evil. In the 20th century, the mushroom took another big step forward. People started to realize that they weren't just delicious, but they were also a superfood. They are one of the few foods that provide vitamin D, and they are full of minerals that help our immune systems. During the World Wars, when meat was hard to find and very expensive, mushrooms became known as the meat of the vegetable world. Because they have a savory, umami flavor, they could satisfy people's hunger for meat without costing a fortune. Today, the mushroom is a global superstar. We have moved way beyond the simple white button mushroom. We now eat shiitake, portobello, oyster, and the incredibly expensive truffle. Some of these mushrooms are so rare that people still use trained dogs or pigs to find them in the woods, and they can cost thousands of dollars for just 1 pound. We have gone from being afraid to touch a mushroom to paying a month's rent for a few slices of one. But even with all our modern science, the mushroom still keeps some of its mystery. There are still thousands of species in the deep forests that we have never named or studied. There are mushrooms that glow in the dark with a ghostly green light. There are mushrooms that can turn insects into zombies. And yes, there are still poisonous ones out there waiting for an unlucky traveler. The journey of the mushroom teaches us a powerful lesson about human nature. It shows us how quickly we can turn fear into fascination. It survived being called the devil's bread, being used as a weapon for Roman murders, and being the center of scary ghost stories. It took the curiosity of a French king and the dark, quiet caves of Paris to show us that the most dangerous-looking things in nature can sometimes be the most delicious. So, the next time you see a mushroom on your pizza or in a creamy soup, or even just popping up in your backyard after a rainstorm, take a moment to look at it. Remember that for most of human history, that little shape was a symbol of magic, mystery, and certain death. It is a tiny survivor that proved that even the witch's umbrella can have a place at the king's table. The mushroom reminds us that sometimes the world's greatest treasures are hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to take a bite. If you walk through a vegetable market today, the eggplant is easy to spot. It is often a deep, royal purple with a smooth, shiny skin that looks like it has been polished. It has a unique shape and a rich, meaty texture. But for hundreds of years, in Europe, this beautiful plant was treated like a cursed object. People wouldn't just refuse to eat it. They were actually afraid to be near it. They gave it a terrifying name, the mad apple. They believed that if you took even one bite of this purple fruit, you would lose your mind, your skin would break out in tumors, and your heart would be filled with a permanent, dark sadness. The story of the eggplant is a fascinating tale of cultural misunderstanding and the power of ancient medical myths. It is a story about how a plant that was loved in the East was feared in the West, and how the secret to making it edible was hidden in the way it was cooked. This is the journey of the eggplant, from a insanity-causing weed to a global culinary star. To understand why the eggplant was so feared, we have to look at its family tree once again. Just like the potato and the tomato, the eggplant is a member of the nightshade family. As we have learned in earlier chapters, the nightshades were the villains of the plant world in the eyes of early Europeans. They knew that many wild nightshades were used by assassins to create poisons. Because the eggplant had a dark, almost bruised-looking color and a bitter taste when raw. People assumed it was full of evil juices. But the fear of the eggplant went even deeper than the fear of the potato. In the 1300s, doctors in Italy and Greece followed a very old system of medicine called the humoral theory. They believed that the human body was filled with 4 different liquids, or humors. One of these was called black bile. They believed that if a person had too much black bile, they would become depressed, angry, or even completely insane. When these early doctors looked at the eggplant, they saw a fruit that was dark and bitter. They decided, without any real evidence, that the eggplant was a direct source of black bile. They told everyone that eating eggplants would cause melancholy, which was a fancy word for a deep, dark sadness. They also claimed that it caused cancers and leprosy. They believed the purple skin was a warning sign from nature, showing that the fruit was bruised and corrupted from the inside. This is why the name Mela insana, or mad apple, was born. For nearly 500 years, this name hung over the eggplant like a dark cloud. While Europeans were hiding from the mad apple, the rest of the world was having a completely different experience. In India and China, the eggplant had been grown for thousands of years. In fact, it is one of the oldest known vegetables in human history. In ancient India, it was called the king of vegetables. They didn't see it as a source of madness. They saw it as a miracle of nature. They used it in curries, they roasted it over open fires, and they even used it in their own traditional medicine to help people feel better. The difference in how people felt about the eggplant came down to one very simple thing: how they prepared it. In Asia, cooks had discovered a secret that Europeans hadn't figured out yet. Raw eggplant is naturally bitter because it contains tiny amounts of substances that the plant uses to protect itself from insects. If you just pick an eggplant and eat it raw, it tastes terrible and can give you a very bad stomachache. The cooks in India and the Middle East knew that you had to tame the eggplant. They learned that if you sliced it, covered it in salt, and let it sit for a while, the salt would draw out the bitter juices. Then you had to cook it thoroughly by frying it, baking it, or stewing it until the spongy white flesh became soft and buttery. When cooked this way, the poison disappeared, and the eggplant became delicious. But because Europeans didn't know this secret, their first experiences with eggplant were bitter and painful, which only made them more sure that the mad apple stories were true. The turning point for the eggplant in Europe happened because of two groups of people: Middle Eastern traders and Jewish communities moving across the Mediterranean. In the 800s and 900s, Arab traders brought the eggplant to Spain and Sicily. They brought the recipes with them, too. They showed that when you combined eggplant with olive oil, garlic, and spices, it transformed into something amazing. The Jewish communities in these areas were some of the first to embrace the eggplant because they moved frequently and shared recipes across different countries. They became the unofficial ambassadors for the mad apple. They realized that the eggplant was a perfect meat substitute because it was so filling and could soak up any flavor you added to it. Slowly, the neighbors of these communities started to notice that their Jewish friends were eating the insanity fruit and were staying perfectly healthy and happy. But even with this proof, the mad apple reputation was hard to kill. In the 1700s, many people in Northern Europe still grew eggplants only because they looked exotic and beautiful. They would put them in vases or grow them in glass houses to show off to their friends, but they would never dream of putting a piece in their mouth. They still believed the old stories that it would cause tumors or make their hair fall out. In the United States, the eggplant had a similar struggle. Thomas Jefferson, who was a big fan of new and strange plants, brought eggplant seeds back to his home in Virginia. He tried to get people interested in them, but most Americans just thought they were weird. For a long time, the only people in America who ate them were immigrants from Italy and China. To everyone else, they were just a foreign weed that smelled funny when it was cooked. The real rebranding of the eggplant finally happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This was the era when cooking became more of a science and less of a superstition. Chefs in France and Italy began to create masterpiece dishes that were so delicious that people were willing to forget their fears. One of these dishes was eggplant parmesan. By layering the sliced eggplant with tomato sauce and cheese and baking it until it was golden and bubbly. Italian chefs created a meal that tasted like pure comfort. Another famous dish was ratatouille from France. This was a slow-cooked stew of vegetables where the eggplant played the most important role. It provided the meatiness that made the stew feel like a full meal. As these recipes became famous, people started to realize that the madness wasn't in the fruit, it was in the myths. They realized that the black bile stories were just old-fashioned mistakes. Scientists eventually studied the eggplant and found that it was actually packed with antioxidants and fiber. They found that the purple skin, which people once thought was a sign of disease, was actually full of a special nutrient called niacin that helps protect brain cells. The very fruit that was supposed to make you lose your mind was actually helping to keep your brain healthy. Today, the eggplant is a hero of the modern kitchen. It is the star of moussaka in Greece, baba ganoush in the Middle East, and mapo eggplant in China. We have learned to appreciate all the different shapes and sizes, from the giant dark purple globes to the tiny white egg-shaped varieties that gave the plant its English name. The journey of the eggplant teaches us a very important lesson about fear and knowledge. It shows us how easy it is to label something as evil just because we don't understand it or don't know how to use it correctly. It survived being called a mad apple, being blamed for tumors and leprosy, and being seen as a source of dark sadness. It took the wisdom of ancient Eastern cultures and the creativity of Mediterranean chefs to show the world the truth. So, the next time you see an eggplant, don't see a mad apple. See a plant that traveled halfway around the world to prove its worth. See a fruit that was once a royal favorite in India and a forbidden poison in Italy. The eggplant is a reminder that beauty is often found in the things we are most afraid of, and that a little bit of salt in a hot pan can turn a curse into a masterpiece. The mad apple didn't make us crazy, it just waited patiently for us to get smart enough to take a bite. If you look at the world today, it is almost impossible to find a place where corn isn't the star of the show. It is in our cereal, our snacks, our soda, and even the fuel in our cars. It is the most grown crop on the entire planet. But for hundreds of years, corn had a very dark and scary reputation in Europe. People didn't just think it was cheap food. They believed it was a biological curse. In parts of Italy, Spain, and France, people who ate corn started to go through a horrific transformation. Their skin would turn into thick black scales. They would become afraid of the sun. They would lose their minds and eventually they would die. This is the story of maize, the great grain of the Americas, and the deadly mistake that turned a miracle plant into a nightmare. To understand how corn became so feared, we first have to travel back thousands of years to the Americas. To the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Inca, corn was not just food, it was life itself. Their legends said that the first humans were actually created out of corn paste. It was a holy plant, a gift from the gods. They grew it in a very smart way alongside beans and squash. They called these the Three Sisters because they helped each other grow. Corn provided the pole for the beans to climb, and the squash covered the ground to keep the soil moist. For thousands of years, the people of the Americas were strong, healthy, and tall because of their corn diet. They had a secret, a special way of preparing the corn that made it safe and nutritious. They didn't just grind it up and eat it. They would soak the hard corn kernels in water mixed with wood ash or lime. This process had a very long and difficult name, but we can just call it the lime secret. Without this secret, the corn holds on to its vitamins so tightly that the human body cannot use them. But the lime secret unlocks those vitamins, especially a very important one called vitamin B3. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean and saw corn for the first time. He was amazed by these giant stalks with golden ears. He brought the seeds back to Europe, and at first, everyone was excited. Corn grew much faster than wheat or rye. It could produce double or triple the amount of food on the same amount of land. Farmers loved it because it was easy to grow and hard to kill. Within a few decades, corn spread across the sunny fields of southern Europe like a golden wave. But then, the horror began. In the early 1700s, a mysterious and terrible disease started appearing among the poor farmers in Italy and Spain. At first, they noticed a strange redness on their hands and necks, like a bad sunburn. But the redness didn't go away. Instead, the skin began to thicken and turn into dark, rough scales. It looked like the skin of a lizard or a snake. Because of this, the disease was given the name pellagra, which literally means rough skin. But the rough skin was only the beginning. People suffering from pellagra became extremely sensitive to the sun. They would hide in dark rooms because the light felt like it was burning them alive. They stopped being able to digest their food. And then the most frightening part happened. They started to lose their minds. They would suffer from terrible confusion, sadness, and madness. Thousands upon thousands of people died in agony. Doctors were baffled. They didn't know if it was a plague, a curse, or a poison in the air, because this disease only happened to people who were very poor and ate almost nothing but corn. People started to blame the plant. They believed that corn was unnatural, or that it carried a New World poison. High society Europeans looked at the corn-eating peasants and saw them turning into scaly monsters. They decided that corn was only fit for pigs and cows. They believed that if a civilized person ate corn, they would eventually rot from the inside out, just like the peasants. For over 200 years, corn was seen as a peasant's curse and a dangerous weed that caused insanity. But here is the mystery. Why weren't the Native Americans getting sick? They had been eating much more corn than the Europeans for thousands of years, and they were perfectly healthy. The answer was the lime secret. When Columbus and the other explorers brought corn back to Europe, they brought the seeds, but they didn't bring the culture. They didn't bother to ask the native people how they cooked it. The Europeans thought they knew everything. They treated corn just like they treated wheat. They ground it into flour and made bread or porridge. They didn't use the wood ash or the lime because they skipped the lime secret. The people eating the corn were slowly starving to death. Even though their stomachs were full, they were suffering from a massive vitamin deficiency because the corn was locking up the nutrients. The Europeans were so busy thinking they were superior that they failed to see that the primitive people they had conquered were actually much more advanced in the science of food. The fear of corn lasted for a very long time. Even in the United States in the early 1900s, there was a massive pellagra epidemic in the South. Over 100,000 people were getting sick every year. Once again, people blamed the bad corn. Some even wanted to ban corn entirely and burn the fields. It wasn't until a brave doctor named Joseph Goldberger started studying the problem that the truth finally came out. Dr. Goldberger did something incredible. To prove that pellagra wasn't a contagious poison or a germ, he and his team actually ate the skin scales and the waste of sick patients. It sounds disgusting, but he was willing to do anything to prove his point. He didn't get sick. He realized that the disease was caused by what was missing from the food, not what was in it. He looked at the history of the Native Americans and finally understood the importance of the lime secret. Once the world finally understood how to process corn correctly, the curse was lifted. Corn went from being a scaly poison to being the hero of the world's food supply. We learned that we could add vitamins back into cornmeal, and we learned that a balanced diet would keep the pellagra away. Today, corn has completely conquered the planet. It is the backbone of modern civilization. We use it to make sugar for our drinks, oil for our cooking, and feed for the animals that give us meat and milk. It is a miracle of nature that can grow in almost any climate. It is so successful that we sometimes forget it was ever a forbidden food. But the history of corn teaches us a very important lesson about humility and respect. It shows us that fear often comes from a lack of understanding. The Europeans were so afraid of the poison grain because they didn't respect the people who discovered it. They thought they could take the fruit without taking the wisdom. The scaly curse wasn't a fault of the plant. It was a fault of the people who were too proud to ask for the recipe. So, the next time you eat a taco, a piece of cornbread, or even just a bowl of popcorn, remember the thousands of years of history in that golden grain. Remember the three sisters in the ancient fields of Mexico and the lime secret that saved the world. Corn survived being called a scaly poison, being blamed for madness, and being seen as cow food. It took centuries of suffering for the world to realize that the Native Americans were right all along. The corn wasn't the curse. Our own ignorance was. Now, corn stands tall as a global treasure, a plant that truly feeds the world. one golden kernel at a time. Close your eyes and imagine a small, quiet village in Europe hundreds of years ago. It is a cold, rainy year, and the harvest has been difficult. The people are hungry, so they go to the local baker and buy loaves of dark, heavy bread made from rye. But a few hours after eating, something terrifying begins to happen. One woman starts screaming that her hands are on fire, even though there are no flames. A man begins to dance wildly in the street, unable to stop until he collapses from exhaustion. Others claim they see demons flying through the air or angels descending from the sky. Within days, some people's fingers and toes begin to turn black and fall off. In the Middle Ages, people thought this was a curse from God or a spell cast by a witch. They called it St. Anthony's fire. But the real killer wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was hiding inside their bread. This is the story of rye, the grain of the poor, and the tiny black fungus that caused mass madness, changed the history of witchcraft, and forced humans to rethink the very bread they ate to survive. To understand why rye was so dangerous, we first have to understand the difference between the rich and the poor in old Europe. Back then, your social status was written on your dinner plate. If you were wealthy, a king, a lord, or a high-ranking priest, you ate white bread. This was made from highly refined wheat. It was soft, light, and very expensive. But if you were a peasant, a farmer, or a laborer, you ate black bread. This was made from rye or barley. Rye is a very tough grain. It is a survivor, while wheat is delicate and needs good soil and warm sun. Rye can grow in the cold, damp, and rocky ground of northern Europe. Because it was so easy to grow in bad conditions, it was incredibly cheap. For millions of people in places like Germany, Russia, and France, rye bread was the only thing keeping them alive. It was their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But this survivor grain had a dark secret that thrived in the same damp weather that rye loved. The secret was a fungus called ergot. It looks like a small, hard black horn growing out of the side of the rye grain. To a hungry peasant in a dark barn, these black horns just looked like dirty pieces of grain. They would grind them up right along with the rest of the rye and bake them into bread. What they didn't know was that ergot is one of the most powerful natural drugs on Earth. It contains chemicals that are very similar to LSD. When you eat it, it does two things to your body. First, it constricts your blood vessels, cutting off the blood to your hands and feet. This makes your skin feel like it is burning, which is why they called it fire. Eventually, the skin dies, turns black, and the limb can actually fall off. Second, it attacks the brain, causing vivid, terrifying hallucinations and uncontrollable muscle spasms. For over 500 years, outbreaks of ergotism or St. Anthony's fire would wipe out entire villages. People would go from being normal neighbors to a screaming, hallucinating mob in a single afternoon. Because they didn't know about fungi or germs, they looked for someone to blame. They usually blamed the devil or witches. Many historians now believe that some of the most famous witch trials in history, including the Salem witch trials in America were actually caused by rye bread. In 1692, a group of young girls in Salem began to have fits, scream about being pinched by invisible spirits, and see strange visions. If you look at the weather records from that year, it was a very wet and cold spring, perfect weather for ergot to grow on the rye. The girls weren't possessed by magic. They were likely suffering from bread poisoning. But because the people of that time didn't understand the madness grain, they ended up hanging innocent people instead of throwing out the moldy bread. Because of these terrifying outbreaks, rye bread developed a very bad reputation. High society people looked at black bread with horror. They didn't just see it as poor people food, they saw it as cursed food. They believed that if you ate rye, you were inviting the devil into your body. For a long time, the goal of every person in Europe was to get rich enough so they never had to touch a slice of rye again. They wanted the pure white bread of the kings. But as the centuries passed, the mystery of the madness was finally solved. Scientists in the 1800s began to use microscopes to study plants. They finally saw the ergot fungus for what it was. They realized that it wasn't a curse. It was just a mold that grew in the rain. Bakers and farmers began to use the sourdough secret. They found that if they used a sourdough starter, which is a mix of natural yeast and good bacteria, to ferment the rye dough, the acidity of the dough helped make the bread safer and easier to digest. They also learned to clean the grain more carefully, removing the black horns before grinding. Once the poison was removed, the world began to see rye in a completely new light. In the 20th century, the reputation of rye bread flipped completely. Scientists began to realize that the white bread the king had been eating for centuries was actually not very healthy. It was missing all the fiber and vitamins that were found in the dark, heavy grains. Suddenly, the peasant bread became the health bread. People discovered that rye is packed with nutrients that help the heart and keep blood sugar steady. In countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, rye bread, especially the dark, dense pumpernickel, became a source of national pride. It went from being a punishment for being poor to being a luxury for people who wanted to live a long and healthy life. Today, we use rye to make everything from gourmet sandwiches to high-end crackers. We even use it to make some of the world's most expensive whiskeys. We no longer fear the hallucination grain because we know how to handle it with care. We have mastered the fungus and kept the nutrition. The journey of rye bread teaches us a powerful lesson about the hidden dangers in nature and the importance of science. It shows us how a simple mistake in the kitchen can change the history of an entire religion or lead to a witch trial. It survived being called a cursed grain, being blamed for demonic possession, and being seen as peasant trash. It took hundreds of years of suffering for us to realize that the grain wasn't the enemy, the mold was. So, the next time you see a loaf of dark, hearty rye bread, remember its dark and stormy past. Remember the villages that danced until they collapsed and the fire that burned without flames. Rye is a survivor that traveled through the darkest times of human history to become a hero of the modern kitchen. It is a reminder that even the humblest black bread has a story that is as rich, complex, and sometimes as crazy as the people who eat it. The hallucination grain didn't just feed our bodies, it shaped our myths and taught us the difference between a curse and a crop. Now, it stands as a global staple, a dark and delicious treasure that we can finally enjoy without fear. Close your eyes and imagine you are an explorer hundreds of years ago, stepping off a wooden ship onto the shores of a mysterious and beautiful new world. You are invited to a grand palace made of stone, where an emperor sits on a throne of gold. He offers you a drink in a golden cup. It is dark, thick, and covered in a frothy foam. You take a big sip, expecting something sweet like honey. But instead, your mouth is filled with a cold, bitter, and spicy liquid that tastes like dirt and chili peppers. You probably want to spit it out. You might even think the emperor is trying to poison you. This was exactly what happened to the first Europeans who tasted chocolate. For thousands of years, the food of the gods was something that most people today wouldn't even recognize. It wasn't a sweet treat. It was a bitter medicine and a holy drink used in blood sacrifices. This is the story of cacao, the bean that was once used as literal money, the heathen drink that the church almost banned, and the secret inventions that turned a bitter seed into the most popular sweet in the world. To understand why chocolate was so misunderstood, we have to look at its original home in the tropical rainforests of Central and South America. The story begins nearly 5,000 years ago with the Olmec and Mayan people. They discovered a strange tree called the cacao tree. It grew colorful pods that looked like footballs hanging from the trunk. Inside these pods were seeds wrapped in a sweet white pulp. At first, people only ate the sweet pulp. They threw the bitter seeds away. But eventually, someone discovered a miracle. They found that if you let those bitter seeds sit in the sun to ferment, then dried them, and then roasted them over a fire, they created a smell that was like nothing else on earth. The Mayans believed that the cacao tree belonged to the gods. They used the beans to create a drink called zocolatl, which means bitter water. They would pour the drink back and forth from a great height to create a thick, bubbly foam. To them, the foam was the most important part because they believed it contained the soul of the drink. When the Aztecs rose to power, chocolate became even more important. In their capital city, which is now Mexico City, it was too dry for cacao trees to grow. This made the beans incredibly valuable. They were so valuable that the Aztecs used them as money. You could buy a rabbit for 10 beans or a healthy slave for 100 beans. Because it was literal money, only the richest people, the kings, the warriors, and the priests were allowed to drink it. The Emperor Moctezuma was said to drink 50 golden cups of chocolate every single day to give him energy and strength. But again, this wasn't the chocolate we know. It was mixed with cornmeal, vanilla, and very hot chili peppers. It was served cold and bitter. In 1502, Christopher Columbus became the first European to see cacao beans. He saw a group of natives protecting a bag of beans like they were gold. When some beans fell on the floor, the natives scrambled to pick them up as if their lives depended on it. Columbus thought they were a type of almond. He brought some back to Spain, but he didn't know how to cook them, so he ignored them. He missed out on discovering the greatest treasure of the New World. It wasn't until Hernan Cortez arrived in Mexico that the secret of chocolate finally reached Europe. Cortez noticed that the Aztec soldiers could march all day without getting tired if they drank chocolate. He realized that this bitter water was a powerful medicine. He brought the beans and the recipe back to the King of Spain. But when the Spanish court tried the Aztec recipe, they hated it. They thought it was a drink for pigs. They couldn't understand why anyone would want to drink something so cold, spicy, and bitter. For a while, chocolate was stuck in a reputation trap. People didn't know if it was a food, a medicine, or a poison, because it was so dark and strange. Some religious leaders in Europe were suspicious. They worried that it was a heathen drink used in devil-worshipping rituals. They also noticed that it made people feel very good and energetic. This led to a huge debate in the Catholic Church. Does drinking chocolate break a religious fast? Some priests argued that it was a luxury that made people sinfully happy and should be banned. Others said it was just a medicine and was perfectly fine. The turning point for chocolate happened inside the quiet walls of Spanish monasteries. Spanish monks were the first ones to start experimenting with the Aztec recipe. They decided to make a few simple changes that would change history. First, they took out the chili peppers. Second, they served the drink hot instead of cold. And third, the most important part, they added lots of cane sugar and cinnamon. Suddenly, the pig drink became a delicious sweet miracle. The Spanish loved it so much that they kept the recipe a secret from the rest of the world. For almost 100 years, they didn't want any other country to have it. It was the ultimate royal secret. If you were a person in England or France in the 1600s, you had never even heard of chocolate. The secret finally leaked out in 1615 when a Spanish princess married the King of France. She brought chocolate to the French court as a wedding gift. From there, it spread like wildfire across the high society of Europe. Chocolate houses opened in London, where rich men would gather to drink hot cocoa and talk about politics. But even then, chocolate was still only a drink. It was very thick, very oily, and very expensive. It wasn't the smooth, solid bar we eat today. The next big mystery of chocolate was how to get the oil out. Cacao beans are naturally full of fat, which we call cocoa butter. When you make a drink out of ground beans, the fat floats to the top like yellow grease. People used to have to skim the grease off with a spoon. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten invented a giant machine called the cocoa press. This machine squeezed the fat out of the beans, leaving behind a dry powder. This was the birth of Dutch cocoa. This powder was much easier to mix with water or milk, and it made the drink much smoother. But then, an Englishman named Joseph Fry had a brilliant idea. He took some of that leftover cocoa butter and mixed it back into the cocoa powder with some sugar. He realized that this created a thick paste that could be pressed into a mold. In 1847, he created the world's first solid chocolate bar. People were amazed. For thousands of years, chocolate had been a liquid. Now, for the first time, you could carry it in your pocket and eat it. However, there was still one problem. This early chocolate was dark, crumbly, and a bit gritty. It didn't melt in your mouth very well. The milk secret was still missing. A Swiss man named Daniel Peter spent years trying to add milk to chocolate to make it creamier. But milk has a lot of water in it, and water makes chocolate spoil and turn lumpy. He couldn't figure it out until he talked to his neighbor, a man named Henri Nestlé. Nestlé had just invented a new product, condensed milk. By using milk that had the water removed, Daniel Peter finally created milk chocolate in 1875. The final piece of the puzzle came from another Swiss man named Rodolphe Lindt. He wanted to make chocolate even smoother. One Friday night, he accidentally left one of his mixing machines running in his factory. The machine spent the whole weekend stirring the chocolate, heating it up, and grinding the tiny particles over and over. When Lindt came back on Monday morning, he thought he had ruined the batch, but when he tasted it, he was shocked. The chocolate was silky, shiny, and melted perfectly on the tongue. He called this process conching. This is the reason why modern chocolate feels so smooth today. With these inventions, the press, the bar, the milk, and the conching, chocolate was ready to conquer the world. But it was still very expensive. It took an American man named Milton Hershey to bring chocolate to the common people. He built a massive factory in the middle of a cornfield in Pennsylvania and figured out how to make milk chocolate on an assembly line. He made it so cheap that every child in America could afford a Hershey bar for just a nickel. The journey of chocolate is a story of how we take something forbidden and bitter and turn it into something sweet and universal. It survived being called a devil's brew, being used as a currency for slaves, and being a secret hidden by monks. It survived centuries of being a greasy, spicy medicine that only kings could afford. Today, we eat chocolate to celebrate birthdays, to show love on Valentine's Day, and to comfort ourselves when we are sad. We have moved from the cold, frothy cups of the Aztecs to the elegant truffles of Switzerland. We have learned that the bitter treasure of the rainforest was actually a gift that just needed a little bit of sugar and a lot of human creativity to unlock. So, the next time you unwrap a chocolate bar, take a moment to smell it. Think about the 1,000 years of history inside that wrapper. Think about the Aztec kings, the Spanish monks, and the Swiss inventors who worked for centuries to make that one bite perfect. Chocolate didn't start as a treat. It started as a challenge. It was a bitter water that tested our patience and our imagination. But in the end, the food of the gods lived up to its name, becoming the sweetest victory in the history of food. Close your eyes and imagine you are standing in a busy city square in Europe. Hundreds of years ago, You see a group of priests standing in front of a church, and they look very angry. They are pointing at a new shop that has just opened. Inside that shop, people are drinking a liquid that is as black as ink and smells like burnt wood. The priests are calling it the bitter invention of Satan. They are demanding that the government ban it immediately. They believe that this dark drink is a magic potion from the heathen lands that will steal your soul and make you lose your mind. This was the actual reputation of coffee when it first reached the Western world. For centuries, coffee was one of the most controversial things a person could put in their body. It was banned by kings, hated by doctors, and cursed by religious leaders. It was a drink that caused revolutions, inspired poets, and led to some of the strangest medical experiments in history. This is the story of the devil's drink, from its discovery by a group of dancing goats to its role as the world's favorite morning ritual. To understand where the fear started, we have to go back to the very beginning, high in the mountains of Ethiopia in Africa. Legend says that the story of coffee didn't start with a human, but with a herd of goats. About 1,000 years ago, there was a young goat herder named Caldi. He noticed that after his goats ate the bright red berries from a certain green bush, they started acting very strange. Usually the goats were calm, but after eating these berries, they began to dance, jump, and run around with incredible energy. They even refused to sleep at night. Caldi was curious, so he tried a few of the berries himself. Suddenly, he felt a rush of energy like he had never felt before. He felt wide awake and full of joy. He brought the berries to a nearby monastery to show the monks. But the monks were unimpressed. They thought the dancing berries were a trick of the devil. They threw the berries into a fire to destroy them. But as the berries began to roast in the flames, a wonderful rich aroma filled the room. The monks were so mesmerized by the smell that they pulled the roasted seeds out of the fire, crushed them, and mixed them with hot water. They took a sip and realized that the drink helped them stay awake for their long hours of prayer. The devil's berries had become a tool for the holy. From Ethiopia, coffee traveled across the Red Sea to a country called Yemen. This is where the world's first real coffee culture was born. In Yemen, Sufi monks used the drink to help them concentrate during their midnight prayers. They called it kahwa. For a long time, the people of Yemen kept coffee a secret. They didn't want anyone else to have the energy, beans. They would only sell beans that had been boiled or dried so that no one else could plant them and grow their own trees. By the 1500s, coffee had spread to big cities like Cairo, Istanbul, and Mecca. This is where the first coffee houses appeared. These weren't just places to drink. They were places to talk. People would sit for hours, playing chess and discussing politics, news, and new ideas. But the leaders of these cities became very nervous. They realized that when people drank coffee, they didn't get sleepy or lazy. Instead, they became smart, focused, and started questioning the government. In 1511, the governor of Mecca officially banned coffee. He claimed it was intoxicating and against religious law. He ordered all the coffee in the city to be burned in the streets. But the ban didn't last long. The people loved their coffee so much that they rioted, and the Sultan eventually stepped in and made coffee legal again. This was the first of many times that leaders would try to ban coffee, only to find out that the drink was more powerful than they were. When coffee finally reached Europe in the 1600s, the reaction was even more extreme. Because it was black, bitter, and came from the East, many Christians in Italy thought it was satanic. They believed that since wine was the holy drink of the church, this new black water must be the opposite, a drink of darkness. They begged Pope Clement VIII to ban it for all Christians. But the Pope was a curious man. He asked for a cup so he could taste it before making his decision. He took one sip, smiled, and famously said, "This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let only the infidels have it." He baptized the coffee, making it a Christian drink. Because of the Pope's approval, coffee houses started opening all over Europe, from Venice to London to Paris. But the kings of Europe were still afraid. In England, King Charles II hated coffee houses. He called them seminaries of sedition, which is just a fancy way of saying they were places where people planned to overthrow the king. In 1675, he issued a proclamation to shut down every coffee house in London. But the public was so angry that he had to cancel the order just 11 days later. He realized that if he took away their coffee, he might actually lose his throne. In Sweden, the fear of coffee led to one of the strangest medical experiments ever recorded. King Gustav III was convinced that coffee was a slow-acting poison. To prove he was right, he took two twins who were sentenced to death for murder. He told them that their lives would be spared if they participated in his experiment. One twin was forced to drink 3 pots of tea every day for the rest of his life. The other twin was forced to drink 3 pots of coffee every day. The king waited and waited for the coffee twin to get sick and die. But the years went by, and both twins stayed perfectly healthy. In a funny twist of fate, the king himself was assassinated, and the doctors who were watching the experiment died of old age. But the two twins lived on. The tea twin eventually died at age 83. But the coffee twin lived even longer. The king's experiment backfired, and it proved to the Swedish people that coffee was safe. Today, Sweden is one of the top coffee-consuming countries in the world. While the kings and popes were arguing, the rest of the world was figuring out how to grow their own coffee. Because the Arab world still held the secret of the beans, European countries started trying to steal them. The Dutch were the first to succeed. They managed to smuggle some coffee plants out of Yemen and began growing them in their colonies in Indonesia. This is why we sometimes call a cup of coffee Java, because it was grown on the island of Java. The French also wanted their own coffee. In 1723, a young naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu wanted to bring a coffee plant to the French colonies in the Caribbean. The King of France gave him one single coffee tree from the royal garden. The journey across the ocean was a nightmare. The ship was attacked by pirates, and they went through a terrible storm. Then the ship ran out of fresh water. Gabriel de Clieu was so dedicated to the coffee plant that he shared his own tiny water ration with the tree. nearly dying of thirst himself. But he made it to the island of Martinique, and that one single tree became the ancestor of nearly all the coffee trees in the Americas today. In America, coffee became a patriotic drink because of a tax. In 1773, the Americans were angry at the British for putting a high tax on tea. They threw a bunch of tea into the harbor in what we call the Boston Tea Party. After that, drinking tea was seen as a British thing to do. Drinking coffee became a way to show you were a true American. This is why America is a coffee nation today, while England is still a tea nation. As the centuries passed, coffee went from being a forbidden drug to a scientific fuel. During the Industrial Revolution, factory owners realized that if they gave their workers a coffee break, the workers stayed awake longer and made fewer mistakes. Coffee literally helped build the modern world. It fueled the scientists who discovered electricity, the poets who wrote great books, and the engineers who built our cities. In the 20th century, we figured out how to make coffee even faster. We invented instant coffee for soldiers in the wars, and then we invented the giant espresso machines that make the lattes and cappuccinos we see in cafes today. We learned that the bitter poison was actually full of antioxidants that protect our hearts and brains. Today, we drink over 2 billion cups of coffee every single day. We have specialty coffee where people pay $10 for a single cup of rare beans from Ethiopia, the same mountains where Chaldee's goats first danced. We no longer worry about the devil's drink stealing our souls. Instead, we worry about what will happen if we don't have our coffee in the morning. The journey of coffee is a story of how a simple berry can change the world. It survived being burned in the streets of Mecca, being banned by English kings, and being cursed by priests. It survived a royal poisoning experiment in Sweden and a pirate attack on the high seas. It took the curiosity of a goat herder and the bravery of a French officer to bring it to our tables. So, the next time you hold a warm cup of coffee in your hands, take a moment to smell that rich, roasted aroma. Think about the dancing goats, the secret gardens of Yemen, and the Pope who baptized your breakfast. Remember that you aren't just drinking a beverage, you are drinking a survivor. Coffee didn't just wake up our bodies, it woke up our minds, our politics, and our history. It is a dark, delicious reminder that sometimes the things that scare us the most are the very things we need to help us build the future. Close your eyes and imagine you are a person living in Europe in the late 1600s. You are walking through a busy marketplace filled with familiar things like apples, pears, and carrots. Suddenly, you see something that stops you in your tracks. It is a large, heavy object covered in hard, sharp scales that look like armor. It has a crown of stiff, jagged leaves on top that look like green knives. It doesn't look like a fruit at all. It looks like a weapon or a strange egg from another planet. You have no idea how to open it, how to eat it, or if it might be poisonous. This was the terrifying and confusing first impression the pineapple made on the Western world. The story of the pineapple is one of the strangest in the history of food. It is a story about a fruit that was so rare it became more valuable than gold. It is a story about kings who posed for paintings with it, and rich people who would literally rent a pineapple for a night just to show off to their friends. This is the journey of the alien fruit from the tropical jungles of South America to its role as the ultimate symbol of wealth and hospitality. To understand why people were so shocked by the pineapple, we have to look at where it came from. The pineapple is native to the heart of South America, in the region that is now Brazil and Paraguay. For thousands of years, the native people there loved and cultivated it. They didn't just see it as food, they saw it as a symbol of friendship. When a guest arrived at a village, a pineapple was often placed at the entrance to the home as a sign of welcome. They also used the juice for medicine and the tough leaves to make strong fibers for clothing and nets. In 1493, Christopher Columbus was on his second voyage to the Caribbean. He landed on the island of Guadeloupe and found a deserted village. Inside the huts, his men found strange, scaly fruits that smelled incredibly sweet. They took a bite and were amazed. After months of eating dry biscuits and salty meat on a ship, the burst of sweet, juicy pineapple felt like a miracle. Columbus decided he had to bring this king of fruits back to Spain to show King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. But the pineapple had a major problem. It was a very bad traveler. Back then, ships were slow, and the journey across the Atlantic Ocean took months. Most of the pineapples Columbus tried to bring back rotted in the heat of the ship long before they reached Europe. Out of the dozens of fruits he started with, only one single pineapple survived the journey to Spain. When that one lonely pineapple was presented to the king, it was a sensation. No one in Europe had ever seen anything like it. It was beautiful. It smelled like a mixture of strawberries and peaches, and it tasted like paradise. The king declared it the best thing he had ever eaten, but because only one survived, it became an instant legend. For the next 200 years, the pineapple was the most famous fruit that almost no one had actually seen. It was like a mythical creature. Because pineapples were so hard to get, they became the ultimate status symbol. In the 16 and 1700s, if you had a pineapple on your dinner table, it meant you were incredibly powerful and wealthy. It was a way of saying, I am so rich that I can afford to have a fruit brought across the ocean just for me. This led to a very strange pineapple culture among the rich in England and France. People were so desperate to show off that they wouldn't even eat the fruit. If you were throwing a fancy party, you would put the pineapple in the center of the table as a decoration. Guests would walk around it and admire it, but no one would dare take a bite because the fruit was worth thousands of dollars in today's money. In fact, the fruit was so expensive that a pineapple rental business started. If you weren't quite rich enough to buy one, you could pay a fee to rent a pineapple for one night. You would carry it under your arm as you walked to a party, or place it on your table to impress your guests. Then, the next morning, you would return it to the shop, and they would rent it out to the next person. Sometimes the same pineapple would visit 10 different parties before it finally started to rot and someone was allowed to eat it. The fear of the pineapple wasn't about poison. It was about the danger of its appearance. because it looked like a giant pine cone, which is how it got its English name. Many people weren't sure which part was edible. Some tried to eat the sharp skin and hurt their mouths. Others tried to eat the leaves. Because it was so rare, there were no instructions on how to handle it. It remained an alien object that people admired from a distance, but were afraid to touch. The challenge of the pineapple eventually became a competition for kings and scientists. They wanted to figure out how to grow this tropical fruit in the cold, gray climate of Europe. This was incredibly difficult because pineapples need constant heat and humidity. They built massive glass houses called pineries. These were like early greenhouses, but they were much more complicated. They had to use giant furnaces and pipes to keep the air hot 24 hours a day. They even used layers of rotting tan bark, crushed tree bark, to create natural heat for the roots. It was a massive waste of money and energy, but the kings didn't care. In 1675, King Charles II of England was so proud of the first pineapple grown in his royal garden that he had a famous painting made. In the painting, his royal gardener is kneeling down and handing the king a pineapple like it is a crown made of gold. This painting told the world that the king had conquered nature itself. If you could grow a pineapple in England, you were a master of the world. As time went on, the pineapple started to lose its alien fear and became a symbol of hospitality because the native people of the Americas had used it as a sign of welcome. This tradition moved into European and American culture. Builders began to carve pineapples into the wooden doorways of houses and onto the tops of gateposts. If you stayed at an inn, you might see a pineapple carved into the bedpost. It was a way of saying to a traveler, "You are welcome here, and we will treat you like royalty." The real change for the pineapple happened in the late 1800s, and it was all thanks to the Industrial Revolution. As ships became faster and steam-powered, it became easier to bring fresh pineapples from the Caribbean and Hawaii. But the fruit was still delicate and would spoil quickly. The man who truly changed everything was James Dole. He moved to Hawaii in 1899 and realized that the soil and sun were perfect for pineapples. But instead of trying to ship them fresh, he built a massive cannery. He used a new invention called the Jinaka machine, which could peel and core a pineapple in just a few seconds. By putting the fruit into cans with sweet syrup, he could ship it all over the world without it rotting. Suddenly, the fruit that was once only for kings was available to everyone. A mother in a small town could walk into a grocery store and buy a can of pineapple slices for a few cents. The alien fruit had finally been tamed. It went from being a mysterious object that people rented for parties to being a common ingredient for upside-down cakes and fruit salads. In the 20th century, the pineapple became a symbol of the exotic and tropical vacation. We invented the piña colada drink and started putting pineapple on pizza, which, just like the tomato, caused a huge debate that still lasts today. We learned that the pineapple isn't just sweet. It is full of a special enzyme called bromelain that helps us digest food. The very thing that looked like an armored weapon was actually a health-boosting miracle. Today, we don't think it's strange to see a pineapple in the store. We know exactly how to cut it, and we don't think we need to be a king to eat it. But the history of the pineapple is a reminder of how much we value things that are rare and hard to get. It survived the long, hot journeys across the ocean, the cold winters of European greenhouses, and the fear of its alien armor. It took the pride of kings and the cleverness of industrial inventors to bring it to our tables. So, the next time you see a pineapple, take a look at its armor and its crown. Remember that you are looking at a fruit that people once paid thousands of dollars just to look at. Remember the rental pineapples and the giant glass houses of the kings. The pineapple is a survivor that traveled through history as a symbol of wealth, power, and finally, friendship. It reminds us that even the strangest looking things in nature can be the sweetest treasures as long as we are brave enough to get past the scales. Imagine you are walking through the busy, crowded streets of New York City or London in the year 1850. The air is filled with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages and shouting street vendors. On every single corner, you see small wooden stands with piles of gray, rocky shells for just a few pennies. The price of a cheap snack. Today, you can buy a dozen fresh oysters. They are the hot dogs of the Victorian era. They are everywhere. You don't go to a fancy restaurant to eat them. You stand on the street, slurp them down quickly, and throw the shells into the gutter. Back then, oysters weren't for the rich. They were the primary food for the poorest workers, the homeless, and the hungry. The story of the oyster is a fascinating rags to riches tale. It is a story about a food that was once so common that people got tired of eating it. It involves secret underground oyster cellars, terrifying outbreaks of disease that led to summer bans, and a massive change in the environment that turned a common snack into a rare treasure. This is the journey of the oyster, from the trash food of the working class to the ultimate symbol of high society luxury. To understand how the oyster started, we have to look at the coastlines of the world before modern cities were built. In places like the Chesapeake Bay in America or the shores of France and England, oysters were so plentiful that they actually created giant reefs. They were like the forests of the sea. When the first explorers arrived, they described oyster shells that were as big as dinner plates. The native people had been eating them for thousands of years, leaving behind giant middens or piles of shells that were sometimes as tall as small hills. For a long time, Europeans saw the oyster as a survival food. It was easy to catch. You didn't even need a boat or a hook. You could just walk out into the shallow water at low tide and pick them up. Because they were so easy to find, they were incredibly cheap. In the early 1800s, if you were a poor laborer with only a few cents in your pocket, you bought oysters. They were the cheapest way to get enough protein to survive a hard day of work. This led to the creation of oyster cellars. These were dark, underground rooms in big cities where for a flat fee of 6 cents, you could eat as many oysters as you wanted. These cellars were often noisy, dirty, and filled with the roughest people in town. In those days, a wealthy person would never be seen in an oyster cellar. It would be like a millionaire today going to a dump to find dinner. The oyster was seen as low-class food, something you ate only because you couldn't afford a piece of beef or chicken. But while the oysters were cheap, they carried a hidden danger that made people terrified of them during certain times of the year. This danger led to one of the most famous food bans in history, the R-month rule. For centuries, people were told that they should never eat an oyster during any month that didn't have the letter R in its name. This meant May, June, July, and August were forbidden months. There was a very scary reason for this ban. Before we had refrigerators, oysters would spoil almost instantly in the summer heat. Even worse, during the hot months, the water near the shore would become filled with bacteria. Eating a summer oyster often led to a terrible and deadly disease called cholera. Thousands of people died because they ate a bad oyster in July. People began to believe that oysters were poisonous in the summer, or that they carried a curse. It wasn't until much later that we realized it wasn't the oyster's fault. It was the heat and the dirty water. Because of this fear, many cities passed laws banning the sale of oysters during the summer. If a vendor was caught selling them in July, they could be arrested and their oysters thrown into the river. This created a strange cycle where oysters were the most popular food in the winter, but the most feared food in the summer. It added to the reputation of the oyster as a risky and dirty food that only the desperate would eat. The real turning point for the oyster happened because of human greed and the Industrial Revolution. In the mid-1800s, humans became too good at catching oysters. We invented dredges, which were giant metal claws that were dragged behind, boats to scrape the entire bottom of the ocean. Instead of picking up a few oysters by hand, a single boat could now catch thousands in an hour. At the same time, our growing cities were pouring smoke, chemicals, and waste into the rivers and bays where the oysters lived. Oysters are filter feeders, which means they drink the water around them to find food. Because the water was becoming polluted, the oysters started to die off. Within just a few decades, the giant oyster reefs that had existed for thousands of years were completely destroyed. In the world of food, there is a simple law. When something becomes rare, it becomes expensive. As the oyster populations disappeared, the price started to climb. By the early 1900s, the oyster stands on the street corners began to vanish. The underground cellars closed down. The food that had once been the hot dog of the poor was suddenly becoming hard to find. This is when the rebranding happened. Because oysters were now expensive and rare, the wealthy class started to take interest. High society chefs in New York and Paris realized they could take this peasant snack and turn it into a gourmet experience. They invented fancy dishes like oysters. Rockefeller, where the oysters were baked with butter, herbs, and breadcrumbs. They started serving them on beautiful silver platters filled with crushed ice. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. The oyster had moved from the gutter to the palace. It was no longer a cheap protein for the poor. It was a delicacy for the rich. To eat a raw oyster was now a sign of being sophisticated and having a refined palate. People forgot that their grandfathers had eaten oysters because they were too poor for bread. Now they ate oysters to show they were wealthy. Today, we see oysters as the ultimate luxury. We go to oyster bars and pay $4 or $5 for a single shell. We talk about the merwa, which is the unique taste of the specific water the oyster came from. We treat them with the same respect we give to fine wine. We have also used science to make them safe. With modern refrigeration and clean water testing, the R-month rule is mostly a thing of the past. But the tradition of fearing summer oysters still lingers in our culture. The journey of the oyster teaches us about the cycle of luxury. It shows us how we often value things only when they are about to disappear. It survived being the scavenger food of the poor, being blamed for deadly cholera outbreaks, and being nearly wiped out by industrial pollution. It took the destruction of the great reefs to turn a sea rock into a treasure. So, the next time you see an oyster at a fancy dinner or a seafood bar, remember its humble beginnings. Remember the dark underground cellars and the street vendors of old New York. Remember that the oyster didn't change, its story did. It is a tiny survivor that reminds us that today's trash can become tomorrow's treasure, and that the most important things in our world are often the ones we take for granted until they are gone. The oyster is a reminder that the ocean is a delicate garden, and even the lowliest shell can become a king. Imagine you are living in a small village in Europe hundreds of years ago, during a very long, cold winter. The harvest was bad, and the wheat for your bread has all run out. The cows are thin, and the children are crying because they are hungry. You go to the storage cellar, and the only thing left in the corner is a pile of cold, white, lumpy roots covered in dirt. They are bitter, they are tough, and they smell like the damp earth. You don't want to eat them. In fact, for most of history, eating these would be a sign that you had completely failed. This is the story of the turnip, the root of last resort, and how it went from being a peasant's insult to the secret weapon that built modern farming. The story of the turnip is not a glamorous one. It is a story of survival, of hard times, and of a man who was so obsessed with this vegetable that people called him turnip as a joke. It is a story about how we take the simplest things for granted, even when they are the very things that keep us alive when everything else fails. To understand why people hated the turnip, we have to look back at the days of ancient Rome. To the wealthy Romans, the turnip was the ultimate symbol of being low class. If you were an aristocrat, you ate exotic fruits, expensive meats, and fine grains. But if you were a poor farmer, you ate turnips. In fact, the Romans had a very specific way of insulting people. If they wanted to show that they had no respect for someone, they would throw a turnip at them. It was a way of saying, you are as low and as dirty as this root. They believed that eating turnips made a person's mind slow and heavy. They thought it was a food that was only fit for pigs, cows, and the unrefined peasants who lived in the mud. For over 1,000 years through the Middle Ages, this reputation stayed the same. The turnip was the insurance policy of the poor. Farmers would grow them because turnips are very tough. They can grow in poor soil. They don't care about the cold, and they can stay in the ground all winter without rotting. But no one wanted to eat them. They were the food you ate when the real food was gone. If a traveler saw a family eating turnips, he knew that they were in deep trouble. It was the smell of poverty. But the turnip had a hidden power that no one understood until the 1700s. To see this change, we have to meet a man named Charles Townshend. He was a very powerful British politician and a member of the noble class. He had a high-paying job and a fancy life in London. But then he decided to retire to his farm in the country. Most people expected him to spend his time hunting or drinking wine. But Townshend became obsessed with something else: dirt. At that time, farming in Europe was very inefficient. Farmers would plant wheat one year, and then the next year the soil would be tired. They would have to leave the field empty for a whole year to let the soil rest. This meant that for every 3 years, a farmer only got 2 years of food. People were constantly hungry because they couldn't grow enough. Townshend realized that the turnip was the secret to solving this problem. He discovered that if you planted turnips in the empty year, the soil didn't get tired. In fact, the turnips actually helped fix the soil. Even better, while the turnips were growing, they provided a massive amount of food for the cows and sheep during the winter. Before this, farmers had to kill most of their animals in the fall because they didn't have enough hay to feed them through the winter. But with turnips, the animals could stay alive and grow fat. Townshend began to travel around England, telling everyone they should stop leaving their fields empty and start planting turnips. He talked about turnips so much at dinner parties, in meetings, and in the streets that people started laughing at him. They started calling him Turnip Townshend. They thought it was hilarious that a wealthy lord was spending all his time talking about a peasant root that was only fit for pigs. But Townshend didn't care. He proved that his method worked. His farm became the most productive in the country. Soon, other farmers started to copy him. This was the start of the British agricultural revolution. Because of the humble turnip, there was suddenly more meat, more milk, and more bread for everyone. The population began to grow, and the great famines that used to kill thousands of people every few years began to disappear. The insult root had accidentally saved the nation. But even after it saved the economy, the turnip still struggled with its scary reputation. This leads us to one of the darkest chapters in the turnip's history, the Turnip Winter of 1916. During World War I, Germany was cut off from the rest of the world. They couldn't get any food from outside. Then a terrible rainy season ruined the potato crop. The only thing left that would grow was the fodder turnip, the big, bitter variety that was usually only given to cows. For an entire winter, the people of Germany had to eat turnips for every single meal. They had turnip bread, turnip soup, turnip cutlets, and even turnip jam. Because the turnips were so bitter and watery, people were constantly hungry and miserable. Thousands died of malnutrition. For the people who survived that winter, the smell of a boiling turnip became a symbol of war, death, and extreme suffering. For decades after the war, many people in Europe refused to even look at a turnip because it reminded them of the time they almost starved. This trauma is why many of us today think of turnips as boring or gross. We have forgotten that they were the heroes of the farm, and we only remember them as the last resort during the wars. But in the modern world, the turnip is making a comeback as a superfood. Chefs in Japan and France have discovered baby turnips, small, white, sweet varieties that taste like a cross between a radish and an apple. They have shown that when you don't grow them to be giant cow food, turnips can be delicate and delicious. We have learned that they are packed with vitamin C and minerals that help our bodies stay strong. We have also rediscovered the turnip greens, the leaves on top, which are even healthier than the root itself. Today, the turnip is a staple in many cultures around the world. In the Middle East, they are pickled in bright pink vinegar and served with every meal. In China, they are used to make delicious savory cakes. We have finally moved past the Roman insults and the turnip winter. We are starting to see the turnip for what it truly is, a tough, reliable friend that is always there when we need it. The journey of the turnip teaches us about the importance of giving things a second chance. It shows us that beauty can be found in the mud and that the things we laugh at might be the very things that save us. It survived being thrown as an insult in Rome, being seen as dirty peasant food for 1,000 years, and being the only thing between an entire nation and death during a world war. It took the obsession of Turnip Townsend to show us that a simple root could change history. So, the next time you see a turnip at the market, don't just walk past it. Take a moment to think about its long, hard journey. Think about the Roman farmers, the English lords, and the families who survived the long winters because of this one lumpy root. The turnip isn't fancy, and it isn't cool, but it is a survivor. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the ability to stay in the ground, grow in the cold, and wait for the world to realize how valuable you truly are. The hunger root didn't just fill our stomachs, it built our modern world, one field at a time. Imagine you are sitting at a fancy wooden table in England in the year 1750. Across from you sits a very famous and grumpy writer named Samuel Johnson. He is writing the very first English dictionary. He reaches the word oats, and he smiles to himself as he writes down the definition. He writes, oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. To Samuel Johnson and most of the wealthy people in England, oats were not real food. They were what you gave to your animals, so they would have enough energy to pull your carriage. If a human was seen eating a bowl of thick, gray porridge made from oats, it was a sign of total failure. It meant you were so poor and so desperate that you were eating the same thing as a farm animal. This is the story of porridge. The humble mush, and how it survived centuries of insults to become the ultimate symbol of health and strength. The story of porridge is a story about the fight between the rich and the poor, and between different nations. It is a story about how a simple, tough grain helped build an entire country and then fueled the workers of the Industrial Revolution. This is the journey of oats and barley from the stable to the supermarket shelf. To understand why porridge was so hated by the rich, we have to look at the grain hierarchy of old Europe. For thousands of years, wheat was the king. If you were wealthy, you ate white bread made from refined wheat. It was soft, light, and easy to chew. But wheat is a very picky plant. It needs warm sun, good soil, and just the right amount of rain. In places like Scotland, Ireland, and northern Germany, the weather is often cold, windy, and very wet. Wheat doesn't like to grow there. But oats and barley are different. They are the warriors of the grain world. They don't mind the cold rain or the rocky soil. They can grow almost anywhere. Because they were so easy to grow in these difficult places, they became the only food the poor could afford. In Scotland, oats were the backbone of life. Because the people there were often poor and lived in a harsh climate, they became experts at making porridge. They would take the oats, grind them into a coarse meal, and boil them with water and a little bit of salt. They didn't have sugar or cream back then. They just ate it plain. To the English, who lived in a warmer climate and had more money, this seemed uncivilized. They looked at the Scots eating their porridge and thought it was gross, barbaric. They believed that eating coarse grains like oats would make a person's skin rough and their personality aggressive. They used the word oat eater as a mean insult. They truly believed that oats were a lower form of life that humans weren't supposed to digest. But the Scottish people had a secret that the English didn't understand. They noticed that their horses, which ate oats, were the strongest and fastest animals on the farm. They realized that if oats gave a horse that much energy, it would do the same for a human. The Scottish soldiers who ate porridge could march for miles over cold, wet mountains without getting tired. They were famous for being tough, tall, and strong, while the rich people in London were getting sick from eating too much refined sugar and white bread. The poor Scots were thriving on their animal feed. The fear of porridge wasn't just about it being low class. There was also a fear that it was unhealthy for the stomach. Because oats are very high in fiber, they take a long time to digest. In the 17 and 1800s, doctors believed that the stomach was a very delicate organ. They thought that heavy foods like porridge would sit in the stomach and rot, causing vapors that would make the brain feel foggy. They told people that if they wanted to be smart and sophisticated, they should stick to light white bread and avoid the peasant mush. The big change for porridge happened during the 1800s, and it was all thanks to the Industrial Revolution. As thousands of people moved from farms into big, crowded cities to work in factories, the world needed a new kind of food. These workers didn't have much money, and they didn't have much time. They needed something that was cheap, fast to make, and would keep them full for a long 10-hour workday. Porridge was the perfect answer. A factory worker could buy a big bag of oats for just a few pennies and feed his entire family for a week. Unlike bread, which took a long time to bake in an oven, porridge could be made in one pot over a small fire in just a few minutes. It became the fuel of the worker. Because of porridge, the people who built our modern cities had enough energy to keep going. But the real rebranding of porridge, the moment it went from trash food to health food, happened in America. It was led by a man named Ferdinand Schumacher. He was a German immigrant who moved to Ohio in the mid-1800s. He was shocked to see that Americans were mostly eating eggs, meat, and heavy pancakes for breakfast. He remembered the healthy porridge from his home in Europe and decided to start a business. He bought a small mill and started producing rolled oats. Before this, people had to cook oats for a very long time to make them soft. But Schumacher's machine flattened the oats into thin flakes, which made them cook much faster. He started the German Fruit and Berry Company, which eventually became the world-famous Quaker Oats Company. Schumacher and his partners were geniuses at marketing. They knew that if they wanted to sell oats to the middle class, they had to change its image. They stopped calling it horse food and started calling it the scientific breakfast. They were some of the first people to put their food into clean, colorful boxes instead of selling it out of a dirty barrel. On the front of the box, they put a picture of a man in a Quaker outfit. This was a clever trick to make people think of honesty, purity, and health. They began to pay doctors to write articles saying that porridge was the best food for children's brains and bodies. They told mothers that if they wanted their kids to grow up to be successful and strong, they had to start every morning with a bowl of oatmeal. This was the birth of the breakfast cereal industry. Almost overnight, the low-class mush became the smart choice for the modern family. In the 20th century, the reputation of porridge took another massive leap forward. Scientists began to study the heart and discovered something amazing. They found that a specific type of fiber in oats, called beta-glucan, actually helps lower cholesterol and protects the heart from disease. Suddenly, the animal feed that Samuel Johnson mocked was the very thing that the world's best doctors were prescribing to their patients. We also learned that porridge has what we call slow-release energy because it takes a long time to digest. It doesn't give you a sugar crash like a donut or a sugary cereal does. It keeps your energy steady for hours. This is why athletes today, from Olympic runners to champion bodybuilders, almost always eat a bowl of porridge before they train. The coarse grain of the peasants turned out to be the performance fuel of the elite. Today, porridge is a global superstar. We don't just eat it plain with salt anymore. We have turned it into a gourmet experience. We add fresh berries, honey, nuts, seeds, and even chocolate. We have overnight oats that you don't even have to cook, and instant oats that you can make with just a little bit of hot water. In Scotland, they still celebrate their porridge with a huge world championship called the Golden Spurtle, where people from all over the world compete to see who can make the best bowl of mush. The journey of porridge teaches us about the power of perspective. It shows us how a food can be seen as trash just because the people who eat it are poor. It survived being called horse food by the English, being blamed for foggy brains by doctors, and being seen as a sign of desperate poverty for 1,000 years. It took the survival of the Scottish people and the clever marketing of the Quaker Oats Company to show us the truth. So, the next time you see a bowl of porridge, don't just see a thick gray mush. See a warrior grain that can grow in the freezing rain. Remember the Scottish soldiers who marched over mountains and the factory workers who built our world. Remember Samuel Johnson and his grumpy dictionary. And then remember that today the horse food is the choice of champions. Porridge didn't change its recipe. We just finally realized that the secret to strength was hidden in that simple bowl all along. It is a reminder that the humblest things can often be the most powerful, and that a good breakfast can change the course of history. Imagine you are standing at the entrance of a beautiful white marble temple in ancient Greece thousands of years ago. You have traveled a long way to show your respect to the gods. But as you try to walk through the doors, a guard stops you. He doesn't look at your clothes or ask for your name. Instead, he leans in close and sniffs your breath. If he smells even a tiny hint of a sharp, spicy aroma, he will point toward the street and yell at you to leave. In ancient Greece, if you had eaten garlic, you were officially unclean. You were banned from entering holy places. You were treated as if you carried a physical and spiritual stain. This was the strange reality for garlic, the stinking rose, for most of human history. It is a plant that has been loved and hated more than almost any other. It has been used as a medicine, a weapon against vampires, a reason for a labor strike, and a way to tell the rich apart from the poor. This is the story of how a smelly weed survived centuries of bans and social shame to become the heart and soul of global cooking. To understand why garlic was so controversial, we have to look at the social smell. For thousands of years, garlic was the ultimate class divider. In ancient Egypt, the story was very different from Greece. The Egyptians realized that garlic was a powerhouse of energy. When they were building the Great Pyramids, the pharaohs gave their slaves a daily ration of garlic and onions. They believed it gave the workers the strength to move those giant stones under the hot sun. In fact, there is a famous story that the first labor strike in history happened because of garlic. One day, the supply of garlic to the pyramid workers was cut off. The workers were so angry and felt so weak that they stopped working and refused to go back until their garlic was returned. To the poor people of Egypt, garlic was a lifesaver, but to the rich, it was slave food. Because the slaves smelled like garlic, the wealthy people began to associate the smell with poverty, hard labor, and the lower class. They decided that a refined person should never smell like garlic. This social shame moved into ancient Greece and Rome. As we mentioned, the Greeks banned garlic eaters from their temples. They called it the stinking rose as a joke because while it looked like a beautiful white flower, the smell was anything but sweet. The famous Roman writer Horace once wrote that garlic was more poisonous than hemlock. He believed that only people with stomachs of iron, meaning poor laborers, should ever eat it. If a wealthy Roman was caught with garlic on his breath, He would be laughed at and excluded from fancy dinner parties. The fear of garlic wasn't just about the smell. It was also about the fire inside, because garlic has a very sharp, burning taste when it is raw. Ancient doctors believed it was a hot food. They followed the humoral theory, which we talked about in the eggplant chapter. They believed that eating too much garlic would make a person's blood boil, making them angry, aggressive, and wild. They told the upper class to avoid it if they wanted to stay calm and sophisticated. In the Middle Ages, this reputation became even stronger. Garlic was the peasant's medicine because the poor couldn't afford expensive doctors or exotic spices from the East. They turned to the garlic growing in their backyards. They used it for everything. They rubbed it on wounds to stop infections. They ate it to get rid of stomach worms, and they even wore it around their necks to protect themselves from the Black Plague. Because the poor used it so much, the wealthy class used the smell of garlic as a way to sniff out people who didn't belong in high society. If you entered a royal court and smelled of garlic, the nobles would cover their noses and turn away. They called it peasant breath. For hundreds of years, garlic was a forbidden ingredient in the kitchens of the kings. If a chef in a palace used garlic, he might lose his job. The food of the rich was supposed to be light and delicate, not bold and stinky. But while the rich were avoiding it, the rest of the world was discovering that garlic was a miracle. In China and India, garlic was being used as a master medicine. They didn't care about the social smell as much as they cared about the results. They found that garlic helped the heart, cleared the lungs, and kept the body strong during the winter. In the Middle East, garlic was mixed with oils and lemons to create incredible sauces that were served to everyone, rich and poor alike. The turning point for garlic in Europe finally happened in the late 1800s, and it was all thanks to the king of chefs, Auguste Escoffier. Before Escoffier, French cooking was very complicated and often avoided heavy smells. But Escoffier realized that garlic was the secret weapon of flavor. He found that if you cooked garlic slowly in butter or oil, the sharp, angry smell disappeared and turned into something sweet, nutty, and savory. He began to sneak garlic into his sophisticated French sauces. He didn't tell his wealthy customers it was there. He just let them taste the delicious mystery. When people realized that the best food in the world was made with the peasant weed, the walls of social shame finally started to crumble. Garlic moved from the backyard garden to the finest restaurants in Paris. In the 20th century, garlic found a new role as a supernatural protector. This is where the legends of vampires come in. For centuries, people in Eastern Europe believed that garlic could ward off evil spirits and bloodsuckers. There is actually a bit of science behind this myth. Garlic is a natural repellent for many things. It is very effective at keeping away mosquitoes and ticks, which are real-life bloodsuckers that carry diseases. In a time when people didn't understand how germs worked, they saw that people who used garlic seemed to get sick less often. They turned this observation into a story about vampires being afraid of the smell. This made garlic a hero of the forest, a plant that could protect your very soul. As the world became more connected, the love for garlic exploded. In America, garlic was once called Italian perfume, as a mean joke directed at immigrants. But as Italian, Chinese, and Mexican food became the most popular cuisines in the country, the joke stopped being funny and became a reality. People realized that without garlic, food tasted flat and boring. The real garlic revolution happened in the 1980s and 90s. This was the era of the Garlic Festival. In places like Gilroy, California, people began to celebrate the stinking rose with giant parties. They made garlic ice cream, garlic bread, and garlic fries. They proved that the smell wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. They even called it the breath of life. Today, garlic is the most popular seasoning on earth after salt and pepper. We grow over 25 million tons of it every year. We have black garlic, which is fermented until it is sweet, like balsamic vinegar. We have roasted garlic, which spreads like butter. We have finally realized that the fire inside the garlic is actually a chemical called allicin, which is one of the most powerful natural antibiotics in the world. The very thing that made the Greeks call it unclean is the thing that makes it a health miracle. The journey of garlic teaches us about the silliness of social class. It shows us how humans can reject a treasure just because they think it makes them look poor. It survived being banned from Greek temples, being mocked by Roman writers, and being called peasant breath for 1,000 years. It took the creativity of French chefs and the hunger of the common people to show us that the stinking rose was actually the king of the kitchen. So, the next time you peel a clove of garlic and that sharp, familiar smell fills your kitchen, take a moment to smile. Remember the pyramid workers who went on strike to get their garlic back. Remember the Greeks who had to have their breath checked at the temple door. Remember the vampire hunters and the French chefs who hid the secret in their sauces. Garlic isn't just a spice. It is a symbol of strength and survival. It is a reminder that the best things in life are often bold, a little bit stinky, and very hard to ignore. Garlic didn't change its smell. We just finally grew up and realized that a world without that smell would be a very boring place to live. Imagine you are walking down a narrow street in a crowded city during the middle of winter, hundreds of years ago. The air is freezing and most of the fresh food is gone. But as you pass a row of small, humble houses, you notice a very strong, sharp, and somewhat unpleasant smell wafting through the air. It smells like sulfur and wet earth. You know exactly what it is. Someone is boiling a large pot of cabbage. In those days, that smell was the smell of poverty. If your house smelled like cabbage, it was a signal to all your neighbors that you were struggling. It meant you couldn't afford meat or fine grains. You were eating the survival weed just to stay alive. The story of the cabbage is the perfect way to end our journey through the history of misunderstood foods. It is a story about a plant that was mocked for its smell and hated for its low-class reputation. but eventually became a hero that saved entire nations from disease and starvation. It is a story about a brave sea captain, a stinky secret to health, and a vegetable that survived the harshest winters in human history. This is the story of cabbage, the peasant's insurance policy. To understand why cabbage had such a boring and low reputation, we have to look at how easy it is to grow. Unlike the pineapple or the chocolate we talked about earlier, cabbage doesn't need a tropical jungle or a royal greenhouse. It is a warrior plant that loves the cold. It can grow in poor, rocky soil, and it doesn't mind the frost. In fact, many types of cabbage actually taste better after the first freeze of the winter, because it was so easy and cheap to grow. Cabbage became the primary food for the lower class for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, the wealthy people who built the temples avoided cabbage because they thought it was unrefined. In ancient Greece and Rome, the situation was a bit more complicated. Some Roman writers actually loved cabbage, but they loved it for a very strange reason. They believed that if you ate a large plate of cabbage before a big party, you could drink as much wine as you wanted and never get a hangover. They saw it as a filter for the body. But even then, if a noble Roman was seen eating cabbage every day, people would assume he had lost all his money. It was seen as the food of the desperate and the dull. As the centuries passed into the Middle Ages, cabbage became the most important vegetable in Europe. It was the insurance policy for every farmer. If the wheat died in a flood, or if the cows got sick, the farmer knew that his cabbage patch would still be there. Cabbage is packed with water and fiber, which makes it very filling. It was the bulk of the peasant diet. But because people ate so much of it, and because they usually just boiled it in water till it was mushy and smelly, it became a symbol of a life that was hard, gray, and boring. To the wealthy elite, the smell of boiling cabbage was the smell of the unwashed masses. The fear of cabbage wasn't about poison. It was about social poison. High society people believed that eating too much cabbage would make a person's blood thick and slow. They thought it caused melancholy and bad dreams. In many royal courts, cabbage was banned from the menu because the smell was considered offensive to the king's nose. It was a silent vegetable, something you ate in the dark corners of a hut, not in a palace. But the real rebranding of cabbage happened in a very unlikely place, on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean. This is where we meet one of the greatest heroes of the cabbage story, Captain James Cook. In the 1700s, the biggest killer of sailors wasn't pirates or storms. It was a terrifying disease called scurvy. Scurvy was a horrific way to die. Your teeth would fall out, your old wounds would reopen, and your body would slowly fall apart. No one knew what caused it. They thought it was bad air or the salty sea wind. Captain James Cook was different. He had heard a theory that a certain type of preserved cabbage called sauerkraut might help. Sauerkraut is cabbage that has been shredded, salted, and allowed to ferment in its own juices. This creates a sour, salty food that stays fresh for years without rotting. In 1768, when Cook set sail on his famous voyage around the world, he brought 7,800 pounds of sauerkraut with him. But there was a problem. His sailors hated it. They looked at the sour, stinky mush and refused to eat it. They called it dirty grass and rotten weeds. Cook knew he couldn't force them to eat it, or they might start a mutiny. So he used a bit of royal psychology, just like Parmentier did with the potato. He ordered the sauerkraut to be served every day at the officer's table. He made sure the common sailors saw the high-ranking officers eating it with great delight, pretending it was a rare delicacy. Within a week, the sailors started asking if they could have some too. They thought, if the captain thinks it's good enough for him, it must be special. For the next 3 years, every man on Cook's ship ate a portion of sauerkraut. When the ship finally returned to England, the world was shocked. Not a single man had died of scurvy. This was a medical miracle. The smelly peasant weed had done what the world's best doctors couldn't do. It had conquered the deadliest disease of the sea. Later, science caught up to the story. We discovered that scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C. Cabbage is naturally packed with vitamin C, but the real magic is in the fermentation. When you turn cabbage into sauerkraut, the good bacteria preserve the vitamins and make them even easier for the body to use. The stinky smell that people hated was actually the smell of the bacteria doing their work to save lives. While Captain Cook was using cabbage to save sailors, the people of Eastern Europe and Asia were using it to save their cultures. In places like Russia and Poland, cabbage became the national hero. They created bigos and sauerkraut soup to keep them warm during winters where the temperature stayed below zero for months. In Korea, they took the same idea and added chili peppers and garlic to create kimchi. They realized that cabbage wasn't just filler, it was a canvas for flavor. It could be spicy, sour, sweet, or savory. In the 20th century, the reputation of cabbage took another turn. For a long time, it was seen as war food. During World War II, victory gardens were planted all over America and England, and cabbage was the star because it was so reliable. But after the war, people were tired of survival food. They wanted steak and white bread. Cabbage went back into the shadows for a few decades, seen as a boring vegetable that your grandmother forced you to eat. But in the last 20 years, cabbage has had a massive superfood comeback. We have moved beyond the smelly boiled cabbage of the past. Modern chefs have discovered that if you roast cabbage with olive oil until it is crispy, or if you shred it into a fresh, crunchy coleslaw, it is incredible. We have rediscovered red cabbage and Napa cabbage, and even kale, which is just a type of cabbage that hasn't formed a head. We now know that cabbage is one of the healthiest things you can put in your body. It is full of phytonutrients that help prevent cancer and heal the stomach, the very thing that made it smell like sulfur. A chemical called sulforaphane is the very thing that helps protect our cells from damage. The smell of poverty turned out to be the scent of health. The journey of cabbage is a story of humility and survival. It shows us that the things we think are boring or low class are often the most important things in our world. It survived being mocked by the Egyptian elite, being banned from royal courts, and being called rotten weeds. by grumpy sailors. It took the cleverness of Captain Cook and the wisdom of thousands of years of traditional fermenting to show us the truth. Today, we see cabbage in every part of the world. It is the crunch in your taco, the soul of your kimchi, the heart of your stuffed rolls, and the miracle in your sauerkraut. We no longer see it as a sign that someone is poor. We see it as a sign that someone is smart, healthy, and knows how to cook. So, as we finish this 15-chapter history of food, take a moment to look at the humble cabbage. It isn't as pretty as a pineapple, as energizing as coffee, or as sweet as chocolate. It doesn't have the cool factor of the tomato or the luxury of the lobster, but it has something even better. It has the strength to stay. It is the plant that stayed in the frozen ground when everything else died. It is the plant that stayed on the ships when the sailors were dying. It is the plant that has been our insurance policy since the beginning of time. Cabbage reminds us that the true heroes of history are often the ones who don't make a lot of noise. They are the ones who are sturdy, reliable, and always there when the winter gets long and the journey gets hard. The survival weed didn't just fill our stomachs, it saved our lives, one stinky, salty, wonderful bite at a time. It is a reminder that in the world of food and in the world of life, the things that are built to survive are the ones that truly change the world.